When I read about William Ellery Channing's words at an ordination sermon, I cannot help but think how much of an awakening that must have been for some of the folks. Surely he was literally preaching to the choir, to many of his colleagues, but also for everyone who read that sermon, and it was widely read, both in America and across the world. It was printed and translated into many languages, and it had a lot of staying power. So in the spirit of that awakening, we learn about Reverend Channing. If you can't tell from his words, he was a classical Unitarian preacher. He's a white man, fairly tall, kind of ruffled hair. He was born in New England to a well-off family. His grandfather was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and then went on to prosecute slave traders and slave ships in Rhode Island. That's the stock that he came from. He went to Harvard and graduated in 1798. This is the time frame we're dealing with. And then he was ordained in what was part of the Congregationalist tradition. That's where we draw our history from, but not just UUs, also the United Church of Christ and still Congregationalist churches today, all come from the same branch of Christianity. But Channing, as you could tell, was a little bit more of a humanist than a theist, and he was at least not a Trinitarian Christian. At this time, there was what's called the Unitarian controversy going on in upper middle class white European theologian circles, I imagine. I don't know if other people were thinking too hard about it, but these guys were. And Channing wanted to put off the hardline dogma and the language of punishment that he heard in churches when he was growing up. He would hear words like depravity and worthlessness, and it didn't make sense to him. But as a minister, he was called to go where he was sent, and he went to Richmond, Virginia. And witnessing the horrors of slavery in the South firsthand, further deepened his conviction about the need for moral virtue in religion, and for a religion that lifts people up. But interestingly, he had a kind of change of heart, and actually became more of a theist than he had been when he was younger. It's called a change of heart, he said, that he gave himself up to God, not because of the horrors he had seen, but because of the resilience he had seen in people's spirits, and because he started to experience the divine, not just in buildings and in church services, but everywhere, especially in the natural world, in the sky at night, in the human heart, in human morality, in the virtues, the benevolent virtues he talked about. So after finishing his time in Richmond, he was appointed to the Harvard faculty, and in 1805, the Unitarian controversy came to Harvard, and they had to decide, are we going to be a classically orthodox Trinitarian institution that only educates white rich men, or are we part of the burgeoning Unitarian movement? And it was the liberals of the Unitarians that finally won out, and Channing was at the very center. And this started a schism. Pretty soon, Trinitarian churches didn't want to pulpit swap with Unitarian ministers. And it got worse and worse over those 14 years until this pivotal moment at the ordination of Reverend Jared Sparks in what is now First Unitarian Baltimore in 1819. There's a tradition of giving a sermon at your ordination service. Somebody else gives the sermon. Reverend David Miller did mine. It was lovely. I don't recall him absolutely torching anyone the way that Reverend Channing did at Jared Sparks' ordination. Absolutely taking shots at lots of Christianity. And I can't help but imagine how Reverend Jared felt about that on his special day. He's a footnote in history now, but I guess that's good for him. This was the awakening of Unitarian Christianity in this part of the world, as we know it, and as it is still lived mostly today. If you heard and read the words of that hymn, that comes from the Unitarian strand of Christianity, and it speaks to a lot of what we hold dear. From the Unitarian Universalist database, bibliography website. I don't remember what UUDB stands for at this moment, but that's where it's from. They write, Channing fervently believed God made human nature with its capacity for moral choice and ever-increasing understanding akin to the divine. He confidently preached the possibility of unending moral and spiritual progress for all who would shape their lives in accordance with its demands. So we might call this Christian humanism, or humanism influenced by Christianity, or perhaps, especially in Channing's Unitarian view, humanism influenced by the humanism of the Christ. We're going to get a little deep here. Stay with me. Father Richard Rohr is a Catholic theologian, and he writes in his book, The Universal Christ, that Christ is the name for the transcendent within of everything. It's not someone's last name, although we might preach it that way. It is the name for the transcendent within of everything, of all matter, the whole cosmos, anointed with purpose and goodness that is creative, life-giving, and joyous. Another name for the Christ, he says, is everything in its fullness, in its wholeness, its highest self. That's the way that Channing viewed his Christianity. And he was called to light a path between what was considered orthodoxy, using words like God and Spirit and Christ, and infidelity, having a non-Trinitarian view. And his words were so widely read that they inspired people across the globe, not just within Christian church movements, but also outside of the church. His Christian humanism, writes UUDB, inspired both religious and literary features of the transcendentalist movement. He was considered an exemplar of Christian faith, a champion of human rights and dignity. He effectively fostered social reform in areas of free speech, education, peace, relief for the poor, and anti-slavery. His orations made him, according to Emerson, another UU saint, quote unquote, a kind of public conscience. That he was speaking for the human conscience. But he was more than just a proponent of the transcendentalist and the transcendence, is that word, within the human spirit. He influenced these transcendentalists, these great writers. He was considered the honorary transcendentalist because he didn't attend the meetings of people like Emerson and Fuller and Alcott and Hedge. He didn't attend the meetings, but it was allegedly his idea to start the group, to find the divine in nature, and to push that philosophy and literary critique to its edge. But he didn't go to the meetings because he said, I know how much weight my voice carries, and I don't want to be that influence. The inspiration to go and look in the natural world to find the divine echoes, again, Richard Rohr, who says, creation is the first Bible. That everything visible, without exception, is an outpouring of God. I think Channing would have loved that. As he championed religious liberty, religious freedom, differences of religious opinion, he championed a little bit of heresy from the establishment, and he championed the great humanistic and Unitarian spiritual awakening. But apart from launching this movement that we enjoy today at this sermon in Baltimore at poor Reverend Jared's ordination, he also sought to inspire the non-church folk, not just the writers, not just the upper class folks, but the artisans and the merchants, the poor folks of the Boston area whom he served and ministered to, encouraging them to embrace their ideals of their humanity, to become their best and highest selves, to not buy into the message of depravity and worthlessness, to find messages of wholeness. We might call it today of working up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, of helping people reach the apex of self-transcendence. A lot of transcendence language in Channing. Channing conceived spiritual awakening to be required for everyone, for economic development in a free labor market, for politics, education, art, literature could all be means of development and prosperity. And that any notion that the majority of human beings with a moral nature were created only to be part of the ministry to the luxury and the elevation of the few, the idea that some people were blessed and would go to heaven, that violates the universality of human rights. Channing always came back to the idea of the divine, to his idea of God. But it was an idea that was not high and far away. It was here and present, right alongside humanity, right within humanity, reminding people that the whole purpose of religion, the English word that we get religion, comes from the idea of ligament. Your ligaments are things that connect your body. That's the origin of the word religion, that it's about reconnecting, restoring, remembering, not the original sin that he grew up hearing about, but your original goodness that everyone has. That God created reason and morality for a purpose. And that purpose, in Channing's view, was most seen in Jesus of Nazareth, whom he calls the Christ. And that Christ, the transcendent within, the fullness of everything, the inherent goodness that is in everything, is in people. It is in all things, in all people, not just the wealthy, not just the people who go to church, not just the people who are Trinitarians, not just Americans, not just white folks, everyone. And that our job as human siblings is to remember, to be re-ligamented, to be reconnected, and to live out these highest ideals. So this included for him working on behalf of the folks that society and capitalism treated as not having this Christ-likeness about them, the impoverished and the enslaved. Channing helped found anti-poverty groups wherever he went. It was part of his ministry, part of his ordination, part of his oversight at Harvard. He had social reform included in all of his ministries. And so he was a supporter of anti-slavery from early on, if you remember the story about his grandfather, right, prosecuting slave ships. His granddaddy helped awaken that notion of life and liberty within him, and he was a supporter, and he was a Unitarian. What that means is he was not the Universalist Theodore Parker, who preached with a gun in his pulpit in case pro-slavery folks came to steal human beings back from his church. He was not that radical, not that fiery, we might say. But he was reasoned, and he was well respected, and he was a white guy from New England, and that lent a lot of respectability to the abolition movement. And his support was a huge part of persuading the other upper-class New England folks that it's not all just John Browns and Theodore Parkers in this movement, that there are quote-unquote respectable people who do not deal with quote-unquote inflammatory rhetoric. If you follow some of the coverage and the language around Black Lives Matter and what's been going on in this country for the past few years, you might notice a similar theme. There are people pushing for more urgency and more radicalism, and there are people pushing reason and respectability and morality. We recognize these seeds of much of our modern UU thought all back to people like Channing. See if these sound familiar to our modern UU congregations. Reason and morality, liberal politics, anti-racism work, freedom of belief, earth-based reverence, highest selves, very long sermons, a Euro-Christian lens to view the world, and sometimes a little more talk than action. I think of this awakening over time of Channing's conversion experiences as a great understanding of like our world, of ourselves, perhaps. And I think for me, as a white European man, there's something for me to learn in his understanding of the power of his voice and how he used it to affect change, how he spoke from his heart, his head, and his values. But we can all learn from that regardless of our social location, right? Being aware not just of our limitations, but of our great gifts and our power and how they can be used to affect change. Regardless of our belief system, regardless of our idea of God. Ethicist and theologian G.K. Chesterton wrote, "Your religion is not the church you belong to, but the cosmos you live inside of." It's not how you pray or don't you. It's about the remembering, the religamenting, the restoring, the reconnecting to the transcendent within of everything. That Channing would have said, it is in you, awaiting for you to be awakened to, waiting for you to remember. If you hear the messages of depravity or worthlessness or unwholeness, the language of the Christian humanism, the ministry towards those on the outer edges, the helping folks to find their higher selves, to be restored, to be reconciled, the ideas of abolition and liberation. Channing preached, as we heard, not with a gun in his pulpit or protesting in the streets, but through the gifts that he was endowed with, through the ways that he could make change. Friends, in this historically universalist congregation, we also draw from the Unitarian side of our heritage. May we be awakened to our gifts, to our morality, to our reason, to the transcendent fullness within each of us. And may we use those gifts to become our highest selves, to make a community of highest selves that is in itself a highest self. Last week we talked about the definition and the markers of beloved community. The beloved community is that which is made up of individuals grounded in wholeness and helping the community itself to be one of wholeness, fullness, original goodness. May the cosmos that we live inside of be one of that original goodness, of that fullness and creativity and life that sprang forth not just in the words of Reverend Channing in 1819, but that spring forth in the flowers outside of our houses, in the trees bursting into bloom, in our human hearts, in our human minds, in our human spirits. May this spring in North America be the beginning of that hope. May this month be the beginning of that hope. And may that hope lead us on. Blessed be, amen. It's always strange to ask for money after you give a sermon like that, and here we are. This is the time in our service where we collect our offering of financial resources for the good of this community. There are many ways to give back to the congregation. Giving of monies is just one of them, and this is your first time. There is no expectation that you give. We're just simply glad that you're here. If you feel called to fill out one of our yellow forms or just let us know how you found us, that is all that we ask. If you are willing to give financial contributions, you have a couple of ways. If you're here in the sanctuary, the offering plate is at the rear of the sanctuary. I invite you to drop in whatever you would like into the bowl on your way out. There's no need to come up, or we're not passing anything around here in the sanctuary. Whether you're here